So we'll turn our attention to data classification, ownership, and retention. Data classification being this idea that you have different buckets of information or different types of systems that process this information, and you're able to make risk decisions based on the buckets that you put information into. So you want to be able to evaluate the risk level of your information based on some type of thought, an actual explicit thought on what data is most important to me. And so what you want to do is you want to take the data that you've got and assign it into a bucket by sensitivity, criticality, or any type of security priority. And I'll show you an example here. This notion that you've got different kinds of information that it's out there on your network. And we'll just create a few buckets here. You may say that right now I've got information on my file server. And every single one of you out there has this, a file server with however many terabytes of data sitting on it. And it's just one big flat mess out there. I've heard file servers being referred to as the hot mess file server. And it's nothing but a dumping ground for people to put files. Well, with data classification, what you're trying to do is say, okay, instead of putting everything in one spot like this, let me bucketize it, for lack of a better word, into things based on criticality or importance. So I might say that human relations data, this is all my employee data, is more important than just the general dumping ground of the file server. So I'll put it into a bucket. Like this. You might have engineering data. That's another bucket. Might have legal data. That goes into a bucket. You might have project data. That goes into its own bucket. And so what you end up with is instead of all this data residing on a flat file server, you've got buckets of data that you can now take appropriate action on, or at least focus your resources a little bit better rather than just on, I've got 6 terabytes of information on my file server. I have to safeguard all of it. Well, data classification says maybe not. Maybe you should prioritize the data and then take appropriate action based on those buckets. And so why do you do this? Well, you want to ensure the confidentiality of that information that's there. And if I don't have to protect a 6 terabyte file server, I only have to protect 100 gigabyte buckets. That's a lot easier for me as a security professional. I want to make sure that the integrity of this information is controlled by limiting who can access it, who can modify it. And I want to increase the availability of this information, making sure that people can't overwrite it or delete it or something like that, because only certain people have access to it. A good example here, there's been a lot of ransomware stories in the news recently, and let's look at CryptoLocker. Right, you get a piece of malware, comes as an attachment in an email, you run this thing, and essentially it just looks for file servers, documents, folders, the My Documents folder, your desktop. It finds everything it has access to, encrypts all of the data it can find, and then sends you a nice little note that says, if you want access to your data again, you're going to pay us $300 for it. And so what companies are doing to mitigate the risk of that is bucketizing data, doing data classification and making sure that segmenting things such that only people who have access to this type of data have it, rather than everybody have access to what's on the file server. So some rationale for doing a data segmentation or data classification program. Well, you're avoiding damage to your reputation by reducing the risk or the chances of an unauthorized disclosure. Again, if I've got personal identifiable information and I store it in a Excel spreadsheet on the file server, that's probably a bad thing because everybody's got access to that. But if I stick it into a structured database and only 5 people in the company have direct access to it, I'm doing a big step towards reducing my chances that somebody's going to get in there and compromise that information. A really neat benefit of data classification is that it reduces the cost of overprotection. Instead of protecting that 6 gigabyte or 6 terabyte file server that I've got, I now only have to protect the sensitive buckets that I've got. So now I'm able to focus my security resources effectively on the things that are important to me as a business, the things that I don't want to have compromised. I can enforce accountability now because I've got permission sets and I know that Bob doesn't have access to Jane's information. I can effectively protect my intellectual property, trade secrets, because that's in its own bucket that has very limited access. The same with confidential information. And the other side benefit of this is I might be able to be compliant with industry regulation or federal or legal requirements that say I have to segregate this data now. And I'm exercising my due diligence as a Chief Information Security Officer by bucketizing my PII data off here where we're going to keep strict control over it. If you were going to go through and establish a program for data classification, this is a very lengthy list of the steps that you want to take. I won't bother reading it, but essentially it starts with objectives. You want to come up with the classification policy. That's one of the key elements of this that defines what classification levels you have that you need. You need the tools and processes in place to actually implement that classification program. One of the key steps here, identify information owners. This is how you set the classification, or this is how you determine the classification levels. You go to whoever owns that data and say, how important is this data? Well, that implies 2 things. 1, you know where the data is, and 2, you know who owns it. So that's a key area here. Once you get through classifying the information, looking at auditing processes to make sure that information is being classified appropriately, you have to train the users on how to classify information. Is it a marking at the top of a page? Is it a marking in an email, a watermark, a digital watermark? Whatever the case may be, whatever your process is for classifying information and marking it appropriately, you've got to make sure that the users know how to do that. As an example of some of the security standards that are out there, Department of Defense, everybody's familiar with these, unclassified, SBU, FOUO, and then confidential, secret, top secret, SCI beyond that. In private business, there's a very similar model. It might go something like public information, internal information, confidential, restricted, or regulatory information. And each of those buckets has different requirements for protection, for access. And it allows you as a security professional to go, look, this information is more important than public information. So if I have a limited set of security resources, which I don't care who you are, you all have a limited set of security resources, maybe I'm going to focus them on the restricted information, not on the public information. I've seen companies go so far as to say, our public website, we don't care about that anymore. If it gets compromised and somebody defaces it, okay, we restore from the last known good and we move on. And nobody makes a big deal out of it. Because we're spending all our security resources farther down the stack there on looking at confidential information or protecting restricted information. If you're going to create a classification program, most of the costs are up front with the front end of this, that you have to create the policies for it. You have to create the tools and procedures for marking information. Once you get the program in place, generally there's a small administrative overhead with making sure that things are still being classified appropriately, that you're monitoring for the classification markings and that sort of thing. But really what this gives you is cost savings in terms of focused security. You can create new security schemes. I've got 5 people. 4 of them are dedicated to looking at our crown jewels and making sure that's not being compromised. It gives you a way to optimize your response process and even make better decision making when incidents happen, because you know that, oh, public information was compromised, okay, I don't care about that. And again, this is kind of a shorter list of things if you were going to implement the program. But getting started, questions to ask like what type of data is it that we're trying to protect here, creating the policy, doing some type of impact analysis so I know the effects of a compromise of each type of information. With that knowledge, now I can create my classification levels with whatever makes sense for me. Identifying the roles and responsibilities of the program. Again, that data owner piece is key. Making sure you understand who owns the data so that you can classify it appropriately. And then ongoing monitoring along with the tools that you need, those applications, or sometimes it's just a manual process to put that marking on there. All of those go into your data classification program. As far as criteria go, really how you bucketize data or how you classify data is built on the value of the data to you as an organization, its useful life. Some information may only be good for a year, 3 years. So do you want to mark something as high risk, got to protect this at all costs, for all eternity when the value of it decreases over time? Well, probably not. So there's a useful life or a shelf life of this data that you need to consider as well. The personnel associated with the data and the impact, if it were compromised, what does that mean to me? So all of those things go into making a decision matrix or a classification matrix that you can create. This one was taken out of FIPS 199. But you can create decision matrix that says, here's my different kinds of information. Here's the impact across the slide here. And what I want to do is look at, okay, where on this risk matrix am I really concerned about? I probably don't care about this low column here. Where I'm going to focus my resources then is over here on the severe side, where I might have a big impact from things. Data aggregation. So this is the notion that if I have two public pieces of information separately, what happens when I put them together? Do I create a higher sensitivity of the data when I do that? If so, I need to be able to account for that in my classification program. And so you see this all the time where you've got various unclassified information on government networks, but as soon as you put 3-4 things together, now you've got a potentially a classified picture of what's going on. And so the challenge here is that there may be different data owners for each of those unclassified pieces of information. Who's the data owner when you've got that in aggregate? Depends on your policy. Your policy should define what that is. And again, from an aggregated data perspective, look at what's the impact of the loss. If I have a data breach of 5 PII records versus 50,000, is that a bigger risk? Maybe, maybe not. Your policy ought to dictate that. Based on that aggregation, do I have to have different controls in place based on this? You really want to run through some worst case scenarios as you're coming up with your classification guidance to say, worst case, this is a bad thing, a very bad thing, or a catastrophic thing. And that's what you want to look at as you're going through this classification exercise.